Take a look at the headlines. The United Methodist Church has nearly completed a split that has taken 5 years, and things will never be the same. Some inevitable changes are happening, but also there are massive changes to the denomination that were intentionally made at the General Conference, which just ended on May 3rd. We'll get into those, but first let's do a quick overview of what happened. The United Methodist Church has been the second largest Protestant denomination in the USA for a long time, behind the Southern Baptist Convention. However, unlike the SBC, which is nearly entirely a United States denomination, the UMC is international, and so historically, the United States congregations weren't entirely self-determining, as delegates from Africa, Asia, and Europe, among others, could also influence the denomination's policies. The split of the denomination has been widely reported on during the past 5 years, and the issue at the forefront is sexuality. Every 4 years, the denomination holds a general conference, and in 2016, the issue of sexuality was tabled, pushed off to the future. An article published by Religion News Service was foreboding why United Methodist chaos on sexuality issues will continue. Well, continue it did, and in a nearly unprecedented move, instead of waiting 4 years to deal with the matter, a special general conference was called for 2019. Only once in the history of the United Methodist Church has a special general conference been called, back in 1970, to tie up loose ends on the merger of the Methodist Church with the Evangelical United Brethren. The 2019 special conference took place, and one of the firebrand issues was what to do with the wording in the UMC's Book of Discipline, which said, "The practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching." The decision was made by 53% to 47%, and the result was to keep the wording. Another key thing that happened at the special conference was a path for churches to leave the UMC. The United Methodist Church holds the right to church property, and bishops can also appoint and move ministers. That is to say, under typical conditions, a congregation can't decide they want to leave. Sure, people can get up from the pews and go somewhere else, but the church's property and finances belong to the UMC. But the 2019 General Conference made a way for churches to leave. Since the decision was to keep the denomination's stance opposing the practice of homosexuality, initially it seemed that the more liberal churches would be the ones who would exit. However, in reality, a movement of traditionalist churches formed that decided they would leave. Some reasons for this included that how the denomination's policies were enforced depended upon the bishop and the particular annual conference a congregation was under. In many conferences, churches that were openly affirming of the practice of homosexuality were not being disciplined, and ministers and bishops themselves in homosexual relationships were being permitted. Additionally, the traditionalist congregations often believed that this matter would never go away until the denomination changed. Every general conference would be another fight, and instead of focusing on ministry, the issue of sexuality would divide the denomination year after year. So they left. The deadline to leave under the special provision granted by the 2019 special conference was December 31st, 2023, and 1/4 of the United States congregations went through the process and officially exited the UMC. There were over 30,500 congregations before the split. Over 7,600 left, and now there's just short of 22,000. The percentage of people leaving the UMC over this issue is at least twice as large as similar exits from other mainline Protestant denominations over sexuality, such as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and Presbyterian Church USA. The majority of churches leaving joined a newly created denomination, the Global Methodist Church, which in January 2024 claimed 4,336 congregations. Things were not the same everywhere. Here's the different annual conferences or jurisdictions of the UMC in the United States. The Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary produced a report on churches that left the UMC. 50% of the churches that left the UMC came from just the southeastern jurisdiction in orange. Only 35% of churches in the UMC in the U.S. before the split were from that region, so these churches left at a higher rate than the average. Conversely, the northeastern jurisdiction held 21% of U.S. UMC churches before the split, but only 10% of disaffiliations came from that jurisdiction. Breaking it down even more finely, here are some of the conferences that lost the most. In the Northwest Texas Conference, 81% left. 52% of North Alabama left. 50% of Texas. 50% of South Georgia, 49% of Kentucky, 44% of Central Texas, 43% of Alabama, West Florida, 41% of North Carolina, and 41% of North Georgia. Conferences that lost the fewest percentage of their churches include Oklahoma Indian Missionary, where 0 of 79 churches exited, and Redbird Missionary, where 0 of 22 left. Desert Southwest also had 0 of 127 churches exit. Only 1% left from the New York Conference, California Pacific, and Eastern Pennsylvania. 2% left from California, Nevada, Greater New Jersey, and Northern Illinois, and 3% left from the Alaska Annual Conference and New England Annual Conference. So the division of the UMC seems mostly over, though it's not entirely over, as I'll discuss in a moment. But let's turn first to what is happening in the UMC now that so many of the traditionalist churches have exited. April 23rd through May 3rd of 2024 was the latest General Conference. This was technically General Conference 2020, which was postponed multiple times due to COVID-19. On the day before the conference began, Reverend Darrell Stevens wrote on the United Methodist Insight blog, "Prayers on the eve of the end of the UMC." The blog is from the Progressive Viewpoint, hosted by St. Stephen's UMC, part of the Reconciling Ministries Network. Stevens wrote, "This gathering will not be business as usual. The end is near for the United Methodist Church, at least as we have known it. The resulting special session that met in St. Louis in 2019 proved more divisive than any that came before, enacting a traditionalist plan full of strictures and penalties for LGBTQ persons and their allies. This is also the General Conference that catalyzed and enabled nearly 25% of U.S. congregations to disaffiliate. So I pray for the queer clergy, their allies, and the church that has abused and betrayed them for decades. This week in Charlotte, historical awareness will separate the change agents from those merely swept up in the moment. The UMC is being transformed into something new, and that change requires relinquishing what is old. Active participants in this transformation must be able to distinguish new from old. We are on the eve of the end of the UMC. The birth pangs of a new church are beginning. The old is passing away. Whether accompanied by a bang or a whimper, this church will not be the same UMC it was before. United Methodists, prepare yourselves for a birth or a funeral, or both. But don't fool yourselves into believing that the UMC will continue on as it has been." Similarly, United Methodist News reported, "Bishops urged to prepare for seismic shift." The article said in part, "Just days before the opening of the COVID-delayed General Conference, Bishop Thomas J. Bickerton told his fellow bishops that he sees the possibility for big changes coming out of the United Methodist Church's top policy-making body. Those potential changes include what many General Conference lay and clergy delegates have taken to calling the 3 R's. Those are regionalization, the revised social principles, and removal of the denomination's longtime restrictive language against LGBTQ people, including the end of the 52-year-old statement that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching." In his final address as Council of Bishops president, Bickerton said that if any of these changes receives approval, or any combination of them, this will represent one of those seismic shifts in who we are as a denomination. So now, the conference has taken place. Have the predictions come true? Is this a new UMC? The answer is a resounding yes. One indication of this is that most of the most major changes have happened without any debate. According to UMC procedure, if a piece of legislation gets through its committee with fewer than 10 no votes, it can be added to a bulk package of legislation called the consent calendar. A single up or down vote happens for the entire consent calendar for that day, and for this General Conference, those votes have been going smoothly. On April 30th, the consent calendar was passed by a 667 to 54 vote. What kind of things were approved? Here's the UMC News description of the major changes, which they reported under the headline of LGBTQ bans slowly being eliminated. Remove a ban on annual conferences and denominational agencies from giving United Methodist funds to any gay caucus group or using funds to promote the acceptance of homosexuality. Instead, the provision now says annual conferences and agencies should honor the denomination's commitment not to reject lesbian or gay members. Eliminate the requirement that the General Council on Finance and Administration, the denomination's finance agency, enforce the ban. Instead, the provision says the agency should ensure that church funds do not go to anything that rejects LGBTQ people or limits the response to the HIV epidemic. Strike the ban on boards of ordained ministry from even considering candidates without evaluating whether they are self-avowed practicing gay people, and strike the requirement that bishops rule gay candidates ineligible. Erase the mandatory penalty of at least a 1-year suspension without pay for clergy found guilty of officiating at same-sex weddings or unions. This was the denomination's only chargeable offense with a mandatory penalty. Allow gay clergy in good standing to be appointed across annual conference lines when their bishop can't locate an appointment in their conference. Set a moratorium on judicial proceedings relating to the denomination's bans against self-avowed practicing gay clergy and same-sex weddings. Removed provisions in the traditional plan that banned bishops from consecrating gay bishops and ordaining gay clergy, and it removed changes that the plan made to the denomination's complaint process aimed at empowering the people making complaints. These changes made U.S. national news. AP reported it as United Methodists begin to reverse long-standing anti-LGBTQ policies. As mentioned, one of those bans wasn't simply removed, but replaced. The old statement said in part, "No annual conference board, agency, committee, commission, or council shall give United Methodist funds to any gay caucus or group, or otherwise use such funds to promote the acceptance of homosexuality." And this was removed, and a new ban put in place, as reported by the AP. The mixed wording of the old rule has been replaced with a ban on funding any effort to reject any LGBTQIA+ person or openly discriminate against LGBTQIA+ people. After another vote 1 day later on May 1st, though, many more outlets reported the bombshell. AP's headline was, "United Methodists repeal long-standing ban on LGBTQ clergy." By a vote of 692 to 51, or 93%, the consent calendar was passed, removing a ban on self-avowed practicing homosexuals that had been a policy since 1984. The numbers are striking. Although nobody can know for sure how things would have looked had the 25% of churches that left remained, on initial viewing, it seems likely that these same policies would have passed, with the 75% of U.S. churches remaining producing a 692 to 51 vote, a 93% approval. Having that 25% there would have not been able to overcome those voting to liberalize. Another factor in this is that a number of delegates from outside of the U.S., particularly Africa, were unable to attend and vote in the conference. The UMC requires delegates to be physically present at the conference, and 775 were confirmed as of April 29. 97 were not, or 11% of the total delegates. The U.S., which is the most liberal part of the UMC, was represented at nearly 100%, while the central conferences, including Africa, Europe, and the Philippines, were only at 75% of their full representation. Since these delegates have historically voted more traditionalist, this too is a factor leading to such overwhelming approval of the liberalizing changes. Issues with getting visas are one reason for the absences. However, the church in the U.S. is shrinking quickly and expected to continue, while the international church is growing. In the year 2000, international delegates made up 16% of the total, while in 2024 they made up 44%. Some have posited that this 2024 conference was the last one where the U.S. delegates will outnumber the delegates from other countries. The 2024 conference used numbers from 2020 to determine delegate allocation, so even though there are now disaffiliated congregations that equal about 33% of the size of the current UMC, the UMC was still represented as if it were as large as it was before the split. The immediate concern for many in the U.S. church is that future general conferences could roll back the changes just made. However, this general conference also began the steps toward a major change to the way the denomination works to make this far less likely. On April 25, the UMC delegates favorably passed by 586 to 164 a constitutional amendment to recognize 4 regions in the denomination: U.S., Africa, Europe, and the Philippines. The change would make each region have more self-rule, but it would also discourage the growing international church from interfering in the new order of things in the U.S. church. As AL.com reported it, regionalization may curb world influence on U.S. church rules. Under current rules, these so-called central conferences can make changes to the discipline, of which there are 7, 3 in Africa, 3 in Europe, and 1 in the Philippines. But notably, the U.S. church itself cannot make changes outside of the general conference, meaning that whenever the U.S. church wanted to make a change, it necessarily became an international affair. The whole situation is complex enough that the UMC put out a 5-part series on their website just to explain it. Although this plan has passed pass the General Conference, since it is a change to the Constitution, it needs more work to actually be enacted. Annual conferences also have to vote, and combined, the vote totals need to add up to a 2/3 majority in favor. On May 2nd was more bombshell news. As I've reported on in several videos since 2019, one of the big sticking points has been the wording in the Book of Discipline: the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Well, it's gone. The article on the UM News website had the headline, "Church Ends 52-Year-Old Anti-Gay Stance," and the first line says, "The United Methodist Church's condemnation of homosexuality, which sparked a half-century of conflict, is now no more." This vote did come with debate, but in the end, the removal was by a vote of 523 to 161. Delegates affirmed at the same time this definition of marriage: marriage as a sacred, lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith, adult man and adult woman of consenting age, or two adult persons of consenting age, into a union of one another and into deeper relationship with God and the religious community. Of course, these votes aren't unanimous, and there are still traditionalist voices in the United Methodist Church. Nigerian Bishop John Wesley Yohana said to UM News during the conference, "Marriage is between a man and a woman, period." There are also U.S. ministers with the same view. What will the future look like for them? Bishop David Graves of the Alabama, West Florida, and South Carolina conferences has underscored that ministers and churches in the UMC still have the right to make their own decisions in some areas. He said, "Let me clarify that a church is not required to receive a gay pastor. Like any clergy appointment, an extensive consultation process will happen between the local church, district superintendent, cabinet, bishop, and staff parish relations committee to ensure the church and incoming pastor are honored." Tennessee Western Kentucky Conference Bishop William McAlally similarly said, "First, pastors have always decided who they will marry. This has not changed. Pastors will continue to decide who they will marry. There is no mechanism in conference leadership nor desire on my part to determine who a pastor will marry." The UMC's decisions at this conference have brought them more in line with other mainline Protestant denominations in the U.S., and so it's fitting that after years of preparation, the UMC also voted to open full communion with the Episcopal Church, which similarly allows same-sex clergy and marriages in their denomination. Full communion will be established once the Episcopal Church also approves it, and there's not really any doubt that such will happen. Churches that decide they aren't happy with the new direction in the UMC will no longer find a clear path to leaving. By a vote of 516 to 203, the UMC closed the door to any further disaffiliations, deleting the paragraph added by the 2019 conference that allowed for churches to leave and take their property with them. At the same time, by a vote of 629 to 96, they added a reaffiliation policy to make it easy for churches which left to come back. Though her request was ultimately not heeded, Dixie Brewster, a delegate from the Great Plains Conference, spoke at the General Conference in favor of allowing continued disaffiliations from the UMC. UM News reported that she spoke of her fear that churches troubled by the changes passed by General Conference will be trapped. "I speak in favor of disaffiliation," she said. "I'm very nervous because I want a place for our conservative churches with traditional values to have a way to go peacefully. I don't want them to be caught up in our court system." And the court system, not just UMC ones, but state ones, is the way that churches seeking to exit will likely have to utilize now that the December 31 deadline is passed. Some churches have done this. Attorney Daniel Dalton wrote an article titled, "How a Local United Methodist Church Left the UMC After December 31st, 2023 and Kept Its Property," about Chilmark Community Church in Massachusetts, which went to court and ultimately settled with the UMC and is now out. Also on the topic of churches which remained in the UMC, as I mentioned, the denomination was declining in membership rapidly before the split, and even now with disaffiliation passed, many UMC churches are closing down. March 24th was the last service for Paces Ferry UMC in Atlanta, Georgia, founded in 1877. March 24th was also the last service for Essex UMC in Essex, Illinois. Central United Methodist Church in Phoenix, the oldest Protestant church in the city, voted to close on April 21st. Floral Heights United Methodist Church in Wichita Falls, Texas, held its last service on April 28. First United Methodist Church in North Attleboro, Massachusetts will have its last service on Sunday, May 19, and Grace United Methodist Church in Newcastle, Pennsylvania will close on June 2nd. At the end of the school year, UMC-affiliated Birmingham Southern College will close. It has been in operation for 168 years. With all of the exits, it's unsurprising that the General Conference also voted to decrease the UMC budget by 43%. But being in or being out of the UMC doesn't guarantee success. Take a guess on what the median-sized church in the UMC is. How many members? Ready for the answer? It's 38 people. And the median size of churches which left? It's also 38. Churches at that size, regardless of denomination, especially if they are primarily made up of people past childbearing age, are at serious risk of closing in the next 20 years. Jefferson Community Church in San Antonio used to be part of the UMC, but disaffiliated after the 2019 conference opened a window to do so. On Easter Sunday, 2024, they held their last service. But all in all, the United Methodist division in the U.S. is mostly over. There will be churches trying to disaffiliate still, and there will be some lawsuits, but the churches that were most dissatisfied are no longer in the picture. However, the situation outside the U.S. is still somewhat of an unknown. Will the biggest groups stay UMC, or will they too decide to exit? A small number have made their decision already. In June 2023, the Estonian churches in the UMC followed procedure and left the denomination. There are 18 churches with fewer than 1,000 members. The District of Slovakia also left in 2022. They did not follow the established UMC procedure, as the law in the country permitted them to exit with their property. There are fewer than 300 members in 12 churches. They since joined the Global Methodist Church. Similarly, the Bulgaria-Romania Provisional Annual Conference left the UMC for the GMC. Although UMC leaders say that the exit process did not follow church law, according to national laws, the conference is no longer part of the UMC, and so it's a moot point. Those exits all happened before the General Conference, but on April 25th, 4 annual conferences that contain congregations in Russia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan got the go-ahead to leave the UMC. Combined, there are 66 churches in these conferences, and they will be forming a new Methodist denomination. The largest international conferences, though, have hung on for now. Both sides, the newly liberalized UMC and the traditionalists, such as those in the Global Methodist Church, will be doing their best to woo them to their own camps. Who will succeed in that is yet to be seen. One thing is certain, though: change has come. Methodism in the United States will never look the same.